Tonight, we journey back more than 1,000 years into the courts and chambers of the Frankish kingdoms, places filled with intrigue, ambition, and scandal. Our story is about a woman remembered as one of the most ruthless queens of early medieval Europe, Fredegund of Neustria. Her life was tangled with betrayal, bloodshed, and the whispers of scandal so shocking that, even centuries later, her name still feels wrapped in shadows. Chroniclers accused her of murder, manipulation, and even of sharing a bed with her own stepsons. Whether all of it was true, or whether some of it was rumor carefully shaped by enemies, we will never know for certain. But what we do know is that Fredegund was a survivor, clever, dangerous, and unforgettable. So settle in, dim your lights, let the world quiet around you, and allow yourself to drift into the strange and scandalous world of the early Middle Ages. This is the story of Fredegund, queen, scandal maker, and survivor, and the Frankish kingdom she shaped. Let's start with the world of the Merovingians. Before we understand Fredegund herself, we must understand the world she lived in. It was the 6th century, and the Roman Empire in the West had already fallen. Its cities and legions were gone, its emperors long vanished. In its place, new kingdoms had risen. Among the most powerful of these were the lands of the Franks, stretching across much of modern-day France, Belgium, and Western Germany. The Franks were ruled by the Merovingian dynasty, a family line named after a semi-legendary figure called Merovech. These kings were known for their flowing, uncut hair, a symbol of sacred authority. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to strip him of his claim to rule. It was not only politics, but also ritual and symbolism that bound the dynasty together. By the mid-500s, the kingdom was not a single unified state, but divided among heirs, each ruling their own territory. Neustria in the west, Austrasia in the east, Burgundy in the southeast, and Aquitaine further south. Brothers and cousins ruled side by side, often quarreling, often at war. Alliances were fragile, marriages were weapons, and betrayal was always near. The court of the Merovingian kings was a place of both splendor and suspicion. Gold and jewels decorated their halls, feasts filled their tables, and warriors swore oaths of loyalty. But behind the scenes, plots were woven in whispers. Servants carried secrets between rooms, and queens often played as decisive a role as kings. Women in the Frankish courts were not silent figures in the background. They arranged marriages, formed alliances, and sometimes orchestrated assassinations. Their influence was vast and often feared. Religion, too, shaped this world. Christianity had spread through Gaul, and bishops held great power. The church and the crown were bound together, each relying on the other for legitimacy. But even within the church, politics brewed. Chronicles written by bishops and clerics recorded the events of the age, and their words could elevate or destroy reputations. What they wrote about a queen like Fredegund might have been colored by her enemies, yet their accounts are what survive to us. Daily life outside the court was simpler, though no less tied to the rhythms of survival. Most people were peasants, working the fields, raising livestock, and paying dues to their lords. Villages clustered around churches or fortresses, while merchants carried goods along old Roman roads. The Frankish kingdom was a land where the old Roman past still lingered in ruins and roads. Yet the medieval world was already taking shape. This was the stage upon which Fredegund's life unfolded. Into this world of warrior kings, scheming queens, loyal servants, and whispering bishops, she would rise from the shadows of obscurity to seize a crown. She was not born to royalty. She was not expected to rule. Yet through cunning, ambition, and ruthless action, she would carve her name into history. In the flicker of torchlight in those early Merovingian halls, no one could have guessed that a servant girl would one day become Queen of Neustria. But that is where Fredegund's story begins. in the margins of power, where ambition waited, ready to strike. Let's move on. Fredegund's rise. Fredegund's beginnings were far from royal. Unlike many queens whose birthright carried them into courts and crowns, she was said to have come from humble origins, perhaps even from the ranks of servitude. Chroniclers suggest that she first entered the Merovingian palace as a servant to Queen Audovera, the lawful wife of King Chilperic IV of Neustria. Imagine her then, a young woman moving quietly through the chambers of the Neustrian court, carrying water, tending to garments, listening while her betters spoke. To most, she would have been invisible, just another figure in the great household, expected to obey and disappear into the background. But Fredegund was not the sort to remain unseen. Something about her drew attention. Chroniclers describe her as beautiful, though beauty alone would not have secured her place in history. More than that, she was intelligent, observant, and ambitious. She listened to words not meant for her ears. She watched gestures others ignored, and she learned how power was truly wielded in the Merovingian court, not only by kings on the battlefield, but by those who whispered in their chambers and those who warmed their beds. King Chilperic I, ruler of Neustria, was a man of appetites. He was known for his ambition, his greed, and his willingness to discard even close ties when it suited him. Fredegund, from her position as a servant, caught his eye. What began as glances turned to favor, and what turned to favor soon became intimacy. In time, Fredegund rose from servant to mistress. This was not unusual for kings, who often took lovers openly. What was unusual was the power Fredegund began to wield from this new position. She was no silent companion. She advised, she persuaded, and she maneuvered. She understood that influence could be built slowly, and that every word whispered to the king in private could echo in the policies and decisions of his reign. But Fredegund's rise came at the expense of others, and the Frankish court was not forgiving of ambition. Queen Audovera, the king's lawful wife, soon found herself displaced. Chilperic, enamored with Fredegund, cast Audovera aside. She and her children were set aside, their positions in jeopardy. The chroniclers, hostile to Fredegund, would later claim that she manipulated events to remove Audovera, even engineering her downfall by exploiting a church ritual that forbade a queen from acting as godmother to her own child. Whether this was Fredegund's doing or the invention of her enemies, the effect was the same. Audovera was disgraced, and Fredegund's path was cleared. Yet Fredegund's position was not secure. For a time, Chilperic turned his attention elsewhere, marrying Galswintha, a Visigothic princess of noble blood. This marriage, meant to secure an alliance and elevate Chilperic's standing, might have ended Fredegund's ascent, but court life is rarely straightforward. Galswintha was unhappy in Neustria, her marriage cold and loveless. Within a short time, she was found dead in her bed, strangled. Whispers spread like wildfire through the Frankish kingdoms. Many believed Chilperic himself had ordered her murder, eager to rid himself of a wife he did not love. Others believed Fredegund's hand was in it, that she had orchestrated the death to regain her place at the king's side. Gregory of Tours, the bishop chronicler whose writings provide much of what we know, accused Fredegund outright. Yet Gregory was no impartial observer. He despised her and often painted her in the darkest light. Whatever the truth, the result was clear. Galswintha was gone, and Fredegund rose higher than before. Chilperic took her as his queen, and from that moment onward, Fredegund stepped fully into the stage of power. Now, no longer a servant, no longer a mistress, she was Queen of Neustria, and she would do everything in her power to hold that crown. Fredegund's rise shocked many at court. Nobles looked upon her with suspicion, bishops with disapproval. To them, she was a woman who had clawed her way into queenship through scandal and blood. Yet to the common folk, there may have been something captivating in her story. the servant who had become queen, the woman who had outmaneuvered princesses and noble-born rivals. She embodied both danger and fascination. As queen, she revealed talents that went beyond seduction. She proved herself to be shrewd, calculating, and ruthless when necessary. In a world where alliances shifted as quickly as the seasons, Fredegund learned how to strike first, to silence enemies before they could rise against her. Her hands, the chroniclers tell us, were not clean. Murders and assassinations began to be linked to her name, some perhaps truly her doing, others likely the invention of those who despised her. Her great rival in these years was Brunhilde, the sister of the murdered Galswintha. Married into the neighboring kingdom of Austrasia, Brunhilde became Fredegund's counterpart, another queen of strong will and sharp mind. Between them stretched decades of rivalry, intrigue, and war. The two women would come to symbolize the bitter conflict between Neustria and Austrasia, their feud as much personal as political. But in these early years of her reign, Fredegund was still consolidating her place. She bore children to Chilperic, strengthening her claim. She placed loyal men in positions of influence. She learned when to smile, when to flatter, and when to strike. Every corridor of the Neustrian palace carried whispers. Some admired her audacity, others feared her cunning, and many plotted against her. Yet Fredegund endured. She had risen from the shadows of servitude to the throne itself, and she would not surrender it easily. Her rise was meteoric, but it was also precarious. For every step upward she had taken, enemies multiplied. In the world of the Merovingian Franks, no crown was ever secure, and for Fredegund, the struggles of her reign and the scandals that would define her legacy had only just begun. Let's turn to the web of intrigue. To understand Fredegund's place in history, one must picture the court of Neustria as a vast stage where every figure played a part, some loudly, some in whispers, and some in the shadows. In this setting, Fredegund proved herself not just a queen, but a strategist in a dangerous game where the stakes were nothing less than survival and dominance. Her enemies were many, and her greatest among them was Brunhilde of Austrasia, the sister of the murdered Galswintha. Where Fredegund was accused of being ruthless and cunning, Brunhilde was described as strong-willed, politically savvy, and unyielding. In many ways, they were reflections of each other, and the clash between them would become one of the defining rivalries of the age. Brunhilde did not forgive the death of her sister, nor did she forgive Fredegund for rising into the place Galswintha once held. From her court in Austrasia, she worked tirelessly to undermine Fredegund and Neustria. She urged her husband and her sons to wage war, to strike at Neustria's borders, and to shame Chilperic and his queen. The chronicles, especially those of Gregory of Tours, give us a gallery of scandalous stories, most of them casting Fredegund in the darkest possible light. Gregory describes her as manipulative, cruel, and deadly, a woman who ordered assassinations and poisoned rivals. He claims that she used daggers and knives more readily than diplomacy, and that no one around her could feel secure for long. Whether all of these tales were true or exaggerated, we cannot know. But what is certain is that Fredegund lived in an environment where threats were constant. In the Merovingian kingdoms, death came easily, whether by sword, by illness, or by betrayal. Queens had no luxury of passivity. To survive, one had to act boldly, and act boldly. Fredegund did. Several nobles who opposed her found themselves eliminated in suspicious circumstances. Assassins appeared in the chronicles like shadows slipping through corridors, their daggers flashing before vanishing again into the dark. Rivals at court, and even bishops, sometimes met untimely ends. Each time, suspicion fell upon Fredegund. Sometimes she was accused directly, other times the whispers were quieter, but the pattern was unmistakable. Those who crossed her rarely lasted long. One of the most infamous episodes attributed to her was the attempted assassination of King Guntram, her brother-in-law. Daggers were said to have been sent against him, only for the plot to fail. Gregory of Tours describes these attempts with relish, painting Fredegund as a queen willing to kill even fellow kings to secure her position. But murder was not her only weapon. She wielded charm and persuasion with equal effectiveness. She knew how to win the loyalty of certain nobles, how to flatter and reward, how to promise what they most desired. Those who served her faithfully often prospered. Those who hesitated or betrayed her were made examples of. The rivalry with Brunhilde only deepened. While Fredegund maneuvered in Neustria, Brunhilde worked in Austrasia, guiding her sons and later her grandsons into positions of power. The two women became the symbols of two opposing courts, two queens locked in a battle of influence that spanned decades. Chroniclers, of course, delighted in portraying their feud as one of jealousy and venom, a personal battle fought with poison and daggers. Yet beneath the scandal lay something more, a struggle over the future of the Frankish kingdoms themselves. As Neustria and Austrasia clashed on the battlefield, the rivalry between Fredegund and Brunhilde gave shape to the wars. Armies marched, borders shifted, and treaties were signed and broken. In each case, behind the thrones, the queens played decisive roles. Fredegund advised Chilperic, Brunhilde advised her heirs. The wars of kings were also the wars of queens. And then, of course, came the scandals. Whispered rumors meant to tarnish Fredegund's name. Chroniclers accused her of sorcery, of unnatural passions, of using charms and spells to bewitch Chilperic. In the medieval imagination, powerful women were often linked with magic, as though their influence could not be explained in natural terms. To accuse a queen of sorcery was to suggest that her power was illegitimate, dangerous, even demonic. Among the gravest accusations was the claim that Fredegund had seduced her own stepsons, drawing them into her bed to control them or corrupt them. Whether true or not, these stories reveal much about how her enemies wished her to be remembered. A queen who murdered rivals could be feared, but a queen who blurred the sacred lines of family, who defied both morality and nature, could be despised for generations. The truth behind these scandals remains hidden in the shadows of history. Were they slanders spread by Brunhilde's allies, or were they rooted in reality? Did Fredegund truly commit such acts, or were they the invention of chroniclers who hated her? We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that her reputation became inseparable from these tales, woven together into a legend of scandal and intrigue. For the people of her time, such stories served a purpose. They were warnings against ambition, against women who stepped beyond the roles assigned to them. They were lessons disguised as history, teaching that queens who reached for power would be punished, if not in life, then in memory. Yet if the aim was to diminish her, the effect was strangely the opposite. For here we are, more than 1,000 years later, still speaking her name, still recalling her deeds, whether true or slandered, while so many others of her age have been forgotten. In the candle-lit halls of Neustria, as plots thickened and whispers grew louder, Fredegund continued her dance of survival. She had risen from nothing, claimed a crown, and navigated a court filled with enemies. To hold her place, she wielded every tool available: persuasion, fear, loyalty, and, when needed, the blade in the dark. The web of intrigue she spun would grow only more tangled in the years to come. For power was never permanent in the Merovingian kingdoms. Kings fell, nobles rebelled, armies were defeated. And when Chilperic himself met his sudden and violent end, the full weight of survival fell upon Fredegund's shoulders. She was no longer merely a queen consort. She would now become something even more formidable, a queen mother and regent, ruling in the name of her son. But that part of her story belongs to the next chapter. Now, talking about the scandal of the stepsons. In the history of queens and kings, scandal often clings more tightly than truth. For Fredegund, no story has lingered so persistently, nor so darkly, as the claim that she seduced her own stepsons. It is one of those tales that has been whispered down the centuries, a story repeated by chroniclers with a mix of outrage and fascination, until it became almost inseparable from her memory. To approach this part of her life, we must do so carefully, for the truth is clouded in shadow. The world of the 6th century was a place where rumor itself was a weapon, where a whispered accusation could destroy reputations as effectively as any dagger. And Fredegund had enemies aplenty, rivals at court, ambitious nobles, bishops who disapproved of her rise, and most of all, Brunhilde, the queen who stood across the border in Austrasia. The accusation was stark, that Fredegund, Queen of Neustria, shared her bed with her husband's sons, men who were at once her stepchildren and, by rumor, her lovers. Such a charge was not simply about immorality. In a society bound by kinship and the sanctity of bloodlines, to be accused of such behavior was to be accused of breaking the very fabric of family, of defying both law and nature. Where did this story come from? Much of what we know is filtered through the pen of Gregory of Tours, the bishop whose writings are our most detailed window into this age. Gregory detested Fredegund. His accounts are filled with venom toward her, portraying her as a schemer, a poisoner, and a woman of unquenchable lust. He tells of her alleged affairs with her stepsons, not as passing rumors, but as marks of her corruption. Yet we must remember, Gregory was no impartial observer. He was aligned with other factions, and his portrayal of Fredegund may have been less history than slander. Still, the story persists. It is possible that the accusation carried a political motive. If Fredegund were seen as corrupting her stepsons, then their claims to power could be discredited. If they were cast as tainted by scandal, their loyalty to their father, Chilperic, would be questioned. In a world where lineage was everything, an accusation of sexual impropriety could unravel the legitimacy of an entire branch of heirs. But could there be truth behind it? The courts of the Merovingian kings were places of passion and ambition, where marriages were arranged for politics rather than affection, and where kings and queens often sought companionship elsewhere. Affairs were not uncommon, and scandals of the bedchamber often spilled into the chronicles. Fredegund herself was no stranger to passion. She had risen to power as the king's mistress before becoming his queen. To suggest that she might use her charm again, even toward her stepsons, was not unthinkable in the imagination of her contemporaries. Yet whether the tale was true or not, what matters is how it shaped her image. The queen who murdered rivals was dangerous. The queen who seduced her husband's children was monstrous. Such a story painted her not merely as ruthless, but as unnatural, a breaker of bonds sacred to family and faith. It ensured that her name would be remembered with a stain darker than blood. Let us pause here and imagine the Neustrian court, where such rumors would have spread. Servants whispered them in corridors. Bishops hinted at them in their letters. Nobles repeated them at feasts, lowering their voices as though speaking of something forbidden. And all the while Fredegund walked among them, regal, composed, perhaps smiling, perhaps knowing exactly what was said about her and choosing not to answer. In this silence, the rumors grew stronger, for when a powerful woman refused to defend herself, her enemies could shape the story unchecked. And yet, what defense could she have offered? To deny too strongly would have been to give the tale life. To ignore it was to allow it to linger in ambiguity. Perhaps she calculated that survival mattered more than reputation, that so long as she held power, the whispers could not unseat her. Her stepsons themselves complicate the picture. Relations between them and their father, Chilperic, were strained. Succession in the Merovingian world was always a matter of tension, for kings divided their realms among sons, and brothers often became rivals. If Fredegund was seen as influencing her stepsons, whether through motherly care, political persuasion, or, as the scandal claimed, seduction, it may have deepened the mistrust between father and sons. And mistrust in such courts often ended in violence. Indeed, several of Chilperic's children by other wives died in suspicious circumstances, and once again, the chroniclers laid the blame at Fredegund's feet. They claimed she ordered poisonings and murders to clear the way for her own children to inherit the throne. Whether she truly did so or not, the accusations served the same purpose. They painted her as a woman who would stop at nothing, who would even destroy her husband's bloodline to secure her own. In these years, the rivalry with Brunhilde intensified. Each queen sought to secure the succession of her sons. Brunhilde's children ruled in Austrasia. Fredegund's would inherit Neustria. Every rumor, every scandal, every accusation was a weapon in their war. It is not difficult to imagine that the story of Fredegund and her stepsons may have been one such weapon, sharpened by enemies, repeated by chroniclers, and preserved for us as though it were fact. And yet beyond the scandal, there remains the figure of Fredegund herself, walking the corridors of her palace, balancing survival and ambition, calculating her every move. Did she laugh at the rumors? Did they wound her pride? Or did she simply see them as the cost of ruling in a world that despised powerful women? These questions cannot be answered, but in the silence of history, one can imagine her calm, her composure, her eyes sharp as ever, watching and waiting. For in the end, the scandal did not destroy her. She remained queen. She remained influential. She outlived many of her enemies. And when Chilperic himself was struck down, murdered in a sudden and violent end, it was Fredegund who seized the reins of power for her young son. Whatever the whispers said of her, whatever scandal stained her name, she endured. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all, for the very stories meant to ruin her have instead ensured her immortality. Where other queens have faded into silence, Fredegund remains vivid, remembered not only for her crown, but for her scandal. The queen who rose from servant to sovereign, the queen accused of daggers and poison, the queen who, if we believe the whispers, broke even the bonds of family to secure her place. This is the scandal of the stepsons. Whether true or false, it is the tale that lingers, a shadow that has followed Fredegund for more than 1,000 years. But her story does not end here, for soon the crown would weigh heavier than ever, and her survival would depend not only on whispers and intrigue, but on her ability to govern a kingdom torn by war. The Queen of Scandal would now become the Queen Regent, and the fate of Neustria would rest in her hands. Now time to turn war, politics, and survival. When King Chilperic of Neustria met his sudden and violent end in the year 584, the Frankish court was thrown into chaos. He had been murdered, struck down near his villa at Chell, the killer never identified. Some whispered that Fredegund herself had ordered it, though the evidence was thin and the motives complicated. Whether she was guilty or not, her enemies made certain her name was tied to the king's bloody death. Yet if some expected the fall of Chilperic to be the end of Fredegund's power, they were mistaken. For in the heart of that chaos, she acted swiftly and decisively. She had one surviving son, the infant Clothar. At the time of his father's death, Clothar was only a few months old, utterly incapable of ruling. Yet he was the last hope of Fredegund's bloodline. If he could survive, if he could be recognized as king, then Fredegund would remain at the center of power, not as queen consort, but as queen mother and regent. The path ahead was perilous. Infant kings were vulnerable. Assassination, kidnapping, or usurpation could easily remove them. Rival families, ambitious nobles, even her old enemy Brunhilde of Austrasia, would have seen opportunity in the weakness of Neustria. Fredegund knew this, and she moved with a speed and clarity that reveal her political skill. First, she secured the loyalty of Chilperic's household troops and guards. Without their support, she could not hope to keep the throne. Then she gathered her allies among the Neustrian nobility, reminding them that their fortunes were tied to stability, and that stability required a legitimate heir. Finally, she placed her infant son under the protection of King Guntram of Burgundy, Chilperic's surviving brother. Guntram, who had long been wary of both Neustria and Austrasia, accepted the boy as heir. By bringing him into the guardianship of another king, Fredegund bought her son's safety and her own breathing space. It was a masterstroke. Many widowed queens might have been swept aside after the death of their husbands, left vulnerable and forgotten. But Fredegund transformed her widowhood into a new form of power. She became the regent of Neustria, ruling in her son's name. The years that followed were some of the most turbulent of her life. Neustria was threatened on all sides, by Brunhilde's Austrasia to the east, by restless nobles within its own borders, and by the constant suspicion that Fredegund herself was unfit to rule. But she did not falter. Gregory of Tours, though hostile, admits her cunning in these years. He records her as a woman who could rally armies, who could direct campaigns, who could manage the machinery of government with a sharp hand. When Neustria faced rebellion, Fredegund did not retreat into mourning or silence. Instead, she planned, she negotiated, and she fought. One of her most famous acts as regent was her use of ambush and surprise against her enemies. Unlike kings who often led armies into open battle, Fredegund relied on tactics that were unconventional, even ruthless. She arranged assassinations of enemy leaders, weakening her rivals before conflicts began. She spread rumors and misinformation to sow division, and when she needed to, she deployed her forces with speed, striking unexpectedly and retreating before her enemies could respond. Her rivalry with Brunhilde became even sharper. While Brunhilde ruled as regent for her grandsons in Austrasia, Fredegund ruled for her infant son in Neustria. The two women were now the true power in their kingdoms, and the wars between their realms bore the marks of their influence. Chroniclers painted their feud in vivid, scandalous colors, two queens clawing at each other through murder, manipulation, and endless intrigue. Yet beneath the drama, what we see are two skilled rulers, navigating a male-dominated world with intelligence and determination. It is telling that both were so vilified in the sources. Male kings who murdered brothers or waged endless wars were remembered as strong, even if ruthless. But queens who acted with the same resolve were described as unnatural, monstrous, and scandalous. In many ways, the stories of Fredegund's cruelty and Brunhilde's scheming may reflect the chronicler's discomfort with women who exercise power openly. Still, Fredegund gave them plenty to write about. She was accused of ordering the murder of Bishop Praetextatus of Rouen, a man who had opposed her politically. Gregory of Tours describes how the bishop was stabbed during Easter, and though the assassin was caught, he claimed Fredegund had been behind the plot. Fredegund, appearing before King Guntram, denied it. Gregory, ever hostile, declared that she lied and escaped punishment only because she was too dangerous to accuse openly. Whether she was guilty or not, the accusation added to her reputation as a queen whose hands were never clean. And yet, for all her supposed crimes, she held her kingdom together. Clothar grew, protected by his mother's vigilance. Neustria, though weakened, did not collapse. Fredegund managed to outmaneuver enemies both inside and outside her realm, preserving her son's inheritance against tremendous odds. In these years, she showed not only ruthlessness, but resilience. Imagine her, a widow surrounded by hostile nobles, her infant son cradled in her arms, her enemies whispering of her downfall. Many might have surrendered, fled, or been crushed, but Fredegund endured. She did not allow herself to be pushed aside. She claimed the mantle of power and held it with a grip so tight that even her fiercest enemies could not pry it away. The wars with Austrasia dragged on, marked by raids, skirmishes, and political maneuvering. Fredegund used every tool available: diplomacy when necessary, violence when unavoidable, patience when it served her. Over time, her son's position grew stronger, until Clothar himself could stand as king in his own right. Through it all, Fredegund remained at the center of Neustrian politics. Even as her health declined in later years, she continued to advise, to plot, to plan. Her legacy was not only in the scandals whispered about her, but in the survival of her son and the continuation of her line. Without her skill and determination, Neustria might have collapsed into chaos after Chilpric's death. Instead, it endured, a fragile kingdom, but a kingdom nonetheless. The image of Fredegund in these years is one of endurance. She was accused of murder, of corruption, of scandalous behavior, and yet she remained unbroken. She lived in a world where power was fleeting, where kings were slain and nobles rebelled, where alliances shifted like shadows, and yet she endured. Her enemies saw her as a monster. Her chroniclers painted her as a villainess. But perhaps, in the quiet moments of her life, she saw herself differently, as a mother protecting her child, as a queen protecting her crown, as a woman who had risen from nothing and refused to be cast down again. In the candlelight of her last years, one imagines her reflecting on all that had passed: the rivalries, the scandals, the bloodshed, the whispers that never ceased. And perhaps she allowed herself a small, secret smile, knowing that she had survived it all. But survival was not immortality. Time would soon claim her, as it claims all. And when Fredegund at last passed from this world in 597, she left behind not only a kingdom preserved for her son, but also a legacy written in scandal, rumor, and fear. Her son Clothar II would go on to rule, eventually reuniting the Frankish kingdoms under his hand. But always, in the chronicles, the shadow of his mother lingered. For Fredegund was remembered not only as a queen, but as the scandalous, ruthless woman who had shaped the fate of Neustria. And now, with her life nearing its end, we must ask, what remains of her legacy? Was she truly the monster painted by Gregory of Tours? Or was she a survivor, condemned by history because she was a woman who dared to wield power in a man's world? This question, like so many surrounding Fredegund, remains unanswered. What is certain is that she shaped her time, and that without her, the story of the Merovingian Franks would be very different indeed. Let's time to move on. The end of her life legacy. The story of Fredegund's life is one of shadows and survival, of whispered scandals and whispered plots. By the final years of the 6th century, her path was nearing its end. She had endured more than most, rising from servitude to queenship, accused of murders and affairs, locked in endless rivalry with Brunhilde of Austrasia, left a widow with an infant son to defend, and still she had prevailed. When she died in the year 597, she left behind a kingdom still fragile, but alive, and more importantly, she left behind her son, Clothar II, who would in time grow to be one of the most powerful rulers of the Merovingian age. Her death was not marked by the great scandals of her life. The chroniclers record it with little drama, a passing note that the queen was gone. Yet her absence was felt, for the woman who had for so long held Neustria together, who had inspired both fear and fascination, was no longer there to guide or to plot. In the years after her passing, her son's reign grew stronger. Clothar eventually succeeded not only in ruling Neustria, but in reuniting the fractured Frankish realms. By 613, after the fall and execution of Brunhilde, Fredegund's old enemy, Clothar ruled over all the Frankish kingdoms, becoming the sole king of the Franks. In a way, the survival of his reign was also a final triumph of Fredegund, For had she not protected him through the perils of infancy, had she not defended his inheritance with all her cunning and ferocity, there would have been no Clothar II to bring the Merovingian kingdoms together. Yet when we look back at Fredegund, we do not find her remembered primarily as the mother of a powerful king. Instead, we find her remembered as scandal itself. The chroniclers, especially Gregory of Tours, painted her as a queen dripping in blood and lust. She was said to have poisoned children, murdered bishops, plotted the deaths of rivals, and corrupted her own stepsons. Even her beauty was described as dangerous, as though her very presence was a weapon of destruction. Modern historians, however, approach her differently. They ask whether she was truly guilty of all these deeds, or whether she was the victim of relentless slander by her enemies. It is possible she ordered murders. Indeed, almost certain, for political assassinations were a common part of Merovingian rule. But did she commit all that was said of her? Did she truly seduce her stepsons? Did she kill every rival accused of falling at her hand? Or were these stories sharpened and exaggerated, turned into weapons by those who hated her? The truth is unknowable, but what is certain is that Fredegund was judged by a harsher standard than her male counterparts. Kings who killed rivals were remembered as strong. Queens who did the same were remembered as monstrous. In a society where women were expected to remain in the background, Fredegund stepped into the light, and for that, she was punished in memory, even if not in life. Her story, then, is not only the story of one woman, but of the ways power and gender intertwined in the early Middle Ages. She reveals to us how a queen could shape the fate of kingdoms, and how chroniclers could shape her reputation for centuries. If we strip away the rumors, we find a woman who rose from nothing to the throne of Neustria. We find a mother who fought to secure her son's inheritance. We find a regent who guided her kingdom through years of turmoil. And if we allow the rumors to remain, we find a figure larger than life, scandalous, dangerous, unforgettable. As we close this journey, imagine Fredegund in her final days. The palace quieter now, her son still a boy but destined for greatness, the candlelight flickering on the walls where once whispers of murder and scandal echoed. Perhaps she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that she had done what she set out to do, to survive, to endure, and to ensure that her bloodline did not vanish into the shadows. In that sense, Fredegund achieved what so many of her rivals did not. She outlived many who sought her downfall, and through her son, she left a mark upon the Frankish kingdoms that would last for generations. Her memory may be tangled in scandal, but her reality was survival, and survival, in the brutal world of the Merovingians, was perhaps the greatest victory of all. So tonight, as we lay her story to rest, let us reflect not only on the scandals whispered about her, but on the strength it must have taken to rise from servant to sovereign, to hold power in a hostile world, and to be remembered at all across more than 1,000 years. Fredegund of Neustria, queen, scandal maker, survivor, a woman who, whether loved or hated, has never been forgotten. And so, friends, we come to the end of tonight's journey through the scandal, survival, and legacy of Queen Fredegund of Neustria, from her humble beginnings to her rise as queen, from the whispered scandals of her private life to the ruthless calculations of her political rule. Fredegund's story has carried us through a world of intrigue, rivalry, and resilience. Whether villainous or survivor, she remains a figure impossible to forget, even after more than 1,000 years. As you settle into rest, I invite you to let the echoes of her story fade into the quiet of the night. History, after all, is not only about kings and battles. It is about people, flawed and complex, who lived and endured. If you've enjoyed this gentle exploration, take a moment to subscribe and join me again for the next bedtime journey into the past. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you see Fredegund as a monster or as a mother who refused to be defeated? But for now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and allow yourself to drift into sleep, knowing that the stories of history will be waiting for you when you awaken. Good night, and thank you for sharing this time with me. Thanks.